All right, welcome to the deep dive. This time, you guys have sent us some seriously thought-provoking stuff. We're diving into a question that's, well, kind of fundamental to how we see the world. Can history actually give us any reliable guidance when there's so much potential for, inaccuracies and bias creeping into the accounts we have?
Yeah, it really gets to the core of how we build our understanding, doesn't it? Especially when you think about just how many different versions of the past are floating around out there.
For real.
Ah,
And the variety in the sources you've given us is mind-blowing. We're talking ancient Rome, modern economic trends, even a look at what's happening in geopolitics right now. Trying to make sense of all that, to connect the dots, is ambitious, to say the least, but that's exactly why we're here.
ambitious is putting it mildly.
Right. We're going to get into some juicy topics. How Julius Caesar was a master of, let's say, public image management. The wildly different ways historians have looked at Roman history. How much we can actually trust the sources we base our understanding on. And even a fresh take on Russia's strengths in the current world. So our mission today is to really explore what's in these texts you've sent. They're our primary source, no outside material, and super important, we're not picking sides on any politically charged stuff, just laying it all out. So let's get into it, shall we?
Sounds like a plan. Though, we're walking into this with a few built-in challenges. Like one of the sources you sent points out how our understanding of the past, of what actually went down, can often be, and I quote, inaccurate and vague. Kind of sets the stage right.
Big time. And this isn't just ancient history we're talking about. There's this quote here from Joan Robinson, the economist. She said, "The purpose of studying economics isn't to get a bunch of ready-made answers, but to learn how to avoid being tricked by, well, economists." Makes you wonder how often we're getting a distorted view, not just in economics, but in history, too.
Oh, the possibility of things getting spun, whether on purpose or not, it's definitely there. And Will Durant, the historian, he brings up this really crucial point. He reminds us that we tend to get so caught up in the right now that we forget to look at the bigger picture, the long sweep of, as he puts it, the last 6,000 years.
Yeah.
That wider lens can give us some much needed perspective.
No doubt about it. And it's crucial to remember that the people writing history, well, they're not robots, right? They come with their own baggage, their own perspectives.
Yeah.
One of the sources points out how things like social standing, education, even where they fall on the political spectrum, left or right, can color how a historian presents the story.
Exactly. Someone who was, say, part of the ruling class back in the day or super connected to religious institutions, they'd naturally see things way differently from someone who wasn't in that privileged circle. And, the source material even mentions how some of the most important historical accounts, like parts of the Torah and the New Testament, weren't written down until a good chunk of time had passed after the actual events. Makes you think about how accurate they can really be. Did things get lost in translation? Did details get added or changed over time? It's a valid question.
Which takes us perfectly to our next stop, Roman history, a period that's like the foundation of so much of Western civilization. But the material you sent really forces you to consider how much of what we think we know is shaped by bias, maybe even outright propaganda. Let's start with Livy and his massive work, Ab Urbi Condita. This guy was writing centuries after some of the earliest events he describes. That's a huge gap.
It is a significant gap. And then there's the fact that Livy was pretty tight with Augustus and the whole Julio-Claudian dynasty. Hard to imagine that wouldn't influence his portrayal of them, right? The source even mentions he encouraged Claudius to write history. And we all know how that turned out. Claudius is often considered one of the worst Roman emperors out there.
Talk about a potential conflict of interest.
It's like trusting a company's annual report that was written entirely by the CEO, who also happens to be under investigation for fraud, right? You'd probably want a second opinion.
Absolutely. And Livy isn't the only one with these kinds of connections. The material mentions a whole bunch of Roman historians. Cato the Elder with his, shall we say, traditional views. Cassius Dio writing about stuff that happened 1,000 years before he was even born. Plutarch, Tacitus, even Pliny the Elder, who is buddies with Emperor Vespasian. It really raises the question, can we take these accounts at face value, given who they were connected to or how much time had passed?
It's really interesting when you consider how varied the viewpoints were, even among historians from the same period. Tacitus's accounts, for example, sometimes totally clash with what Suetonius wrote. And like the source points out, someone like Cato, who lived through the Second Punic War, when Hannibal was, stomping all over Italy, would have a very different perspective compared to, say, Tacitus, who lived when the Roman Empire was at its peak. It's like trying to understand a company's culture by only talking to the CEO versus also talking to the employees on the ground floor, right? You get a totally different picture.
Totally. It's all about context. Which leads us to Julius Caesar and his famous Commentari de Bello Gallico, a book many of us probably remember from our school days, but this isn't just some neutral historical account, is it? It's presented in the material you sent as, well, straight-up propaganda.
You hit the nail on the head. The Gallic Wars were a long, drawn-out affair, and not everyone back in Rome was a fan. Caesar had some powerful enemies, those Optimates, the aristocratic faction in the late Roman Republic. They were spreading all kinds of rumors about his ambitions. He needed to find a way to fight back, to make himself look good, and get the regular folks, the plebeians, on his side.
Makes sense. The source quotes George Edwin Rhines, who basically says Caesar needed to go around the Senate and appeal directly to the public, portraying his actions in Gaul as, heroic and beneficial for Rome. It was all about making himself untouchable.
Exactly. And when you consider Edward Bernays' definition of propaganda, he called it the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. Caesar's De Bello Gallico fits the bill perfectly. Sure, there were earlier attempts at shaping public opinion, like that Behistun inscription thing, but Caesar's work is considered one of the first really clear examples of using information, or maybe misinformation, for direct personal gain in politics. It's a reminder that even stuff that looks like simple history can have a hidden agenda.
And it's interesting how the material draws a parallel to what happens in modern politics and media. How the truth often gets twisted to benefit someone or push a certain agenda. Feels pretty relevant today, doesn't it?
For sure. The Roman Republic, as your source points out, was a hotbed for this kind of maneuvering. And the emperors who came later, well, they weren't exactly shy about using propaganda either. Even the historians themselves, their opinions on certain rulers, could definitely influence how they wrote about them.
So if we accept that a lot of history is potentially biased or just plain inaccurate, can we ever really be sure about what truly happened? Will and Ariel Durant, they really wrestled with this in their book, The Lessons of History. There's this whole section called Hesitations where they lay out all the challenges.
Those hesitations are pretty insightful, I have to say. They ask this really basic question. Do we really know what the past was, what actually went down, or is history just a story we all kind of agree on? It's a reference to a famous quote by Napoleon. And they go on to point out all the reasons why getting to the truth is so hard. Our knowledge is always going to be incomplete, the evidence can be shaky, historians have their own baggage, and even our personal beliefs, whether it's patriotism or religion, can warp how we see things.
And Durant doesn't sugarcoat it either. He's got that famous line, most history is guessing, and the rest is prejudice. Kind of a reality check for anyone who takes historical accounts as gospel.
Absolutely. He and Ariel emphasize how historians tend to oversimplify stuff that was actually super complex and cherry-pick the facts that fit their narrative. And then there's the whole issue of how fast things change. Charles Peguy, writing over 100 years ago, said the world had changed less from the time of Christ to his own day than it had in the previous 30 years. Imagine how much truer that is today. We've got technology and science moving at warp speed, and that makes trying to draw neat little lessons from the past even more risky.
And then there's the role of pure chance. Unpredictable events that can completely change the course of history. Like, you got the sudden death of Alexander the Great, which led to his empire crumbling, or Frederick the Great, who was saved by a Russian czar who just happened to be a big fan of Prussia. It's a good reminder that sometimes stuff just happens.
Totally unpredictable. The author of the source material actually says they find it refreshing that a big-name historian like Durant is so upfront about the limits of what we can know about the past. They even say they wish economists would be a little more humble about their own field.
It's a good point, right?
It is. Makes you realize that no matter what we're studying, whether it's history or economics or anything else, a little critical thinking goes a long way. Definitive answers can be pretty hard to come by. Now, the author of this material takes a bit of a left turn and offers up a different way to think about history, specifically Rome. They come from an economics and finance background, so they look at empires like Rome almost like they're analyzing a giant business. What's the big question they're asking with this approach?
The core question is, was Rome's business model sustainable in the long run? And their conclusion, looking at it through that economic lens, is that Rome was, and I quote, destined to fail from the get-go because they were spending way beyond their means right from the start. Which, on the surface, seems kind of wrong when you consider how long Rome actually lasted, both in the West and in Byzantium. The author even acknowledges this apparent contradiction, pointing out that some of those worst emperors we talked about, they popped up pretty early in the empire's history, yet Rome kept chugging along for centuries.
And that's a crucial point. While a purely economic analysis might point to built-in unsustainability because of all that overspending, the actual historical reality is much more complex, right? The author does bring up some similarities they see between the decline of Rome and the challenges facing the U.S. today. Things like illegal immigration, what they see as a decrease in the effectiveness of military force, demographic shifts, and the rise of rival powers. Food for thought for sure, even if historical parallels are never perfect, especially given how fast things change these days.
Definitely gives you another angle to think about. Now, shifting gears again, your sources include a really interesting take on Russia from Peter Hensler. And it's important to note that this was written before the death of Alexei Navalny. What jumped out at you about his argument?
Heisler, who lived in Moscow for over 2 decades, paints a picture of a Russia that's strong, independent, and self-assured. He emphasizes a kind of Russian patriotism, which he distinguishes from nationalism. He says it's about the unity of over 100 different ethnic groups under a shared sense of, well, Russianness. He contrasts that with what he sees in the West, this focus on multiculturalism that, in his view, often highlights differences rather than what people have in common.
Interesting distinction. He also talks about how skeptical Russians tend to be, not just towards Western media, but even their own media and politicians.
Yeah, he emphasizes that a lot, this idea of Russians not just taking things at face value, having a healthy dose of skepticism. He also contrasts Western woke and gender movements with what he sees as a Russian preference for simplicity and a focus on what he calls more basic aspects of human interaction. He suggests that Russian society as a whole tends to reject bullies, people who try to manipulate or control others, with more emphasis on self-regulation.
Sounds like he sees a real difference in how Germany and Russia deal with their, let's say, complicated pasts.
Definitely. He argues that Russia has taken a more, as he puts it, cautious approach to reassessing its history, trying to bring together the Tsarist period, the Soviet era, and the present. Whereas he sees Germany as struggling with a more problematic reassessment, almost like they're trying to erase parts of their history.
And then he delves into Russia's economic and military developments, particularly since those sanctions were imposed in 2014.
Right. He points to how Russia has really pushed for self-sufficiency, especially in agriculture. They've even become a major exporter of wheat. He also talks about the revival of their military industry, claiming they're leading the way in areas like combat aircraft and electronic warfare. He even says they're the second largest arms exporter globally, though he does mention that pricing comparisons with the U.S. are tricky.
And when it comes to their financial situation, he's got a pretty bold perspective, emphasizing how Russia has no net debt and a much lower percentage of global debt compared to a lot of Western nations.
Yeah, that lack of debt equals independence argument is central to his whole point. He even throws in figures showing how Russia's debt has gone down significantly since 2000, while the debt of countries like the U.S. has skyrocketed. He even addresses that gas station masquerading as a country comment that gets thrown around, pointing to GDP growth numbers that show Russia and the BRICS nations as a group have actually outperformed the West in recent decades, and that Russia itself had over 3% growth in 2023.
He also talks about how Russia's a reliable partner when it comes to international agreements and how strong their alliances are within groups like BRICS and the SKO. And then he gets into the historical context of Russia's relationship with the West, which, let's face it, has been pretty tense for a long time.
He gives a historical overview, starting with Western intervention in the Russian Civil War, and he argues that the West has consistently underestimated Russia's military strength and just how determined they can be. Then he offers his take on the conflict in Ukraine, pointing to NATO involvement since 2014, the perceived failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive, and his assessment that, from his point of view, NATO has basically lost the war against Russia.
Wow. But he does acknowledge that those Western sanctions have hurt Russia, like making the prices of everyday stuff go up. But he emphasizes the Russian central bank's response and how resilient their economy is overall, thanks to their low debt levels.
Right.
He even compares what he sees as the effectiveness of the Russian leadership with how, in his view, the current German government isn't very effective.
His big takeaway is that Russia's strengths, no debt, their push for self-sufficiency, their military, and their societal stability give them one crucial advantage. And that's time, especially with potential financial problems looming in the West, maybe as early as 2024. It's a very different picture than what we usually get in Western media, which makes it a good reminder to, look at things from multiple angles.
Lots to think about for sure. Now, let's switch gears completely. One of your sources sheds light on the origin of the phrase helicopter money, which I've always been curious about. Where does that even come from?
Oh, it's a fun little story. Dandy Bala, he stumbled upon this in Papua New Guinea. Turns out some palm oil plantations there actually use helicopters to, get this, drop their workers' pay at designated spots called pay houses. Why? Because the roads are so bad, it's just safer to airlift the cash.
Wow, money literally falling from the sky.
Literally, it's a real-world example of helicopter money that I bet nobody would have guessed.
Right. And the source actually suggests that this could be the original inventor of helicopter money, so to speak. And they even point out that it's more targeted and less prone to fraud than some of those abstract economic theories.
Exactly. It takes a concept that's usually discussed in a very theoretical way and gives it a real-world, tangible example.
For sure. Finally, let's touch on some of the economic and investing stuff from your sources. There's some talk about investor choices, this ongoing debate between those Magnificent Seven stocks and good old value stocks, and then there's the whole discussion about inflation and interest rates, which never seems to go away. Even a mention of modern monetary theory, which, to put it simply, suggests that governments that control their own currency can't really run out of money in the traditional sense.
Yeah, the author hits on a lot of those familiar themes, points out the renewed worries about government debt, for example, but they also argue against the idea of super tight monetary policy, pointing to things like those ridiculously expensive Super Bowl tickets, the record highs we've seen in the Nasdaq, and the growing interest in call options, which usually indicates that investors are feeling pretty optimistic.
But they're not blind to the counter-arguments either, like how commercial real estate is struggling, the problems in some emerging markets, and the fact that commodity prices have been dropping.
And their take on that is actually pretty nuanced. They point to how much government debt has exploded, how the situation for emerging markets and commodities really depends on what region and sector you're looking at, and how this monetary inflation isn't hitting every corner of the economy equally. They even suggest we might see a comeback in commodity prices because global industrial production is expected to bottom out and central banks might start cutting rates.
They also specifically mention how agricultural commodities are pretty cheap right now, especially after you adjust for inflation, and how commercial investors are loading up on them, which could be a sign that prices are about to jump. And of course, they talk about how all this could impact inflation and interest rates down the line.
Yeah, that's the worry, right? Rising commodity prices could lead to inflation in the cost of, well, everything, which could force the Fed to raise interest rates again, and that would probably hit those inflated asset markets pretty hard. The author also highlights how undervalued emerging market stocks are compared to U.S. stocks, especially Chinese equities, and they reference some specific valuation comparisons that have been made.
And they even share some of their own investment picks in China and other emerging markets, suggesting that places like Malaysia and Indonesia might be ready to take off.
It's a glimpse into how they see the markets right now and where they think there might be opportunities.
All right, so let's bring it all back to that original question we started with. Can history actually offer us any solid guidance? After this deep dive into everything you sent us, what's your big takeaway?
I'd say the answer is yes, but with a big asterisk. History can be useful, but only if we're really aware of its limits, the biases that shape it, and the fact that we absolutely need to consider lots of different perspectives. The material you gave us is a perfect example of this, from the propaganda we see in those Roman historical accounts to the wildly different ways people can interpret what's happening in geopolitics today.
So the lesson is clear. Always think about where your information is coming from and the context it was created in, whether it's an ancient text or a hot-off-the-press analysis of current events.
Absolutely, question everything.
Well said. So to wrap up this deep dive, here's something to ponder. With history always kind of rhyming, economic forces constantly pushing and pulling, and global politics always in flux, what unseen forces or biases might be shaping how we understand what's happening right now? What might future deep dives uncover about the stories we believe today? It's a reminder to never stop questioning and never stop digging deeper. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a fascinating one.